Over my career, I've done a lot of interviews with some well-known people and some people no one's heard about before. I thought it might be fun to drag some of them out of the archives and share them here on YouTube. Not everyone can live out his or her childhood dreams, but Donald Davidson has. He grew up in Europe, but listened to racing as a child, and now he's one of America's most respected experts on racing. He's headquartered at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, where we reached Donald Davidson by phone. I asked him about his early days and how living in Europe, in England, he got concerned with and grew to love auto racing.
My true interest in racing began in the mid-1950s, and the fact that motor racing is perceived very differently in England, it was everywhere. I mean, it's not a very big country. I mean, it's smaller than some states, so for some reason motor racing was very popular, and the British drivers were well known, and so it was like, living in a basketball town and hearing the basketball names. You couldn't help but not know who the people were. My dad had an interest, probably slightly more than a passing interest, but while I was aware of it, and I had racing cars in my stocking for Christmas and all this kind of stuff, it didn't bite until I was about 13. And then once it clicked with me, and I can't really explain why or what it was. I mean, I can nail it down in terms of time, but what the attraction was, I mean, I still can't really say to this day, except that it just grabbed me, and I found quite quickly that I could retain the stats that I was reading. And I'm talking Formula One at first. Didn't take long. But anyway, I being given credit for having a photographic memory, and I don't. I'm told it's selective, retentive, easy access. So I was not a very good student, but if something captured my imagination, I just soaked it up. So anyway, I started reading about the history of motor racing, and then I stumbled upon this thing called the Indianapolis 500, which you couldn't pronounce, and what was it? And then I saw a map of the track, and all of the Grand Prix tracks at that time were true road courses. I mean, they didn't have purpose-built road courses in those days. They were actually, county roads that would shut down for the races, with lots of turns. And the Nürburgring in Germany had 176 turns, but the Indianapolis Speedway was 4 left-hand turns. What's all this about? And then the names of the drivers were different. Well, anyway, in short order, I started to find everything I possibly could about it, and my mother got a publication for me called the Floyd Clymer Indianapolis 500 Yearbook, and it was for the 56th season, and my life changed when I got that book. And I started saving up for years, and in answer to your question about hearing the radio broadcast, it took me a while to find it. By probably, I don't know when I first discovered that there was such a thing, but probably 58, I think, because I was already heavy into it by 57, but I don't think I knew about the radio broadcast. Well, it was broadcast by the American Forces Network in Germany. So I tried with great diligence in 58 and 59 to find it, but I couldn't. And all this reception was horrible, and all these stations, because we're not talking push buttons in those days, we're talking dials and knobs. And so with the greatest finesse, I still wasn't able to find it until 1960. So I stumbled on a qualifying show with Sid Collins and Fred Agabasian, and I heard that, and then the race. I took off the day, and I struggled all day long trying to find it, and then finally I was able to get about the last 40 minutes, because in England, it being several hours ahead, it was starting to get dark, and the reception improved. Not that much, but some. So I was able to get little snippets from the 1960 race, and I thought, oh my God, I want to go.
I think so many people have heard the race on Armed Forces Radio. I mean, I really, and I was honored when I was with United Press International that Armed Forces Radio carried our hourly newscast, because our newscasts didn't have commercials in them. We had places where the stations could cut away and put in their own commercials. Yeah. But because Armed Forces had to cut out the commercials, they thought it was a lot easier to carry us or Associated Press. But I have had a lot of people stationed in the weirdest parts of the world come to me during my career and said, you know, I used to listen to the news every day.
52 was the formation of the radio network, and it took a couple of years to... you can go back to the 20s, but the actual formation of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Radio Network was 52, and they didn't do the whole race. Contrary to a lot of what you read and what I understood, the first year they didn't do that. They just did what had been the old mutual radio broadcast format, which was, I believe, 30 minutes at the beginning, sort of like 15 minutes, 15 before, 15 after the start, and then they would do the finish for a half hour and get the final laps and the winner in victory lane, and then they would just do updates during the rest of the day and do other programming. Well, the word was that in 52 they did the 500 flag to flag. They did not. They did the old mutual format. And 53 was the first year that they did the thing live and in its entirety. Well, 54 was the first year that it was the American Forces Network and the Armed Forces Network, I think, which sounds like the same thing. But anyway, the thing is, it was available to the soldiers stationed overseas, and the impact was phenomenal. And the growth of the network, it just was everywhere within 2-3 years, but the impact that it had, not only in the United States but with the servicemen, and there's all of these amazing stories and letters from tearful soldiers that it was Memorial Day and somebody was playing around with the radio and they could get the 500 and they were stationed in some outpost somewhere. And they just felt like they were home. So just the impact. Radio used to be king.
Yes, I know. I remember one of the great track announcers, Mike Ahern, who for years was in Turn 1, was talking about the fact that, and he almost teared up talking about it, that his sister lived in Germany. And that his niece or nephew, I forget what, could hear him do the 500, and he thought, boy, what a small world. And he said it gave him a much greater sense of doing the race, knowing that the family was listening in Europe.
Absolutely. I think one of the most stunning things for me personally was, and I don't know if I could put a year on this, but it's probably about 78 or 79, and I was talking with some fellows outside the press room, and it might have been 1980, but anyway, it was the day before the race, and I was talking with these fellows, and I was aware that somebody was kind of hovering, and he came out to me when we broke up, and I said, did you want to talk to me? I saw you standing there, and he said, yes. He said, are you Donald Davidson? And I said, yes, sir. He said, oh, I recognized your voice. And I said, well, you're clearly not from here. He was from down under. And he said, yes, I'm Australian. And I said, oh, you come every year? He said, no, this is my first year. And I said, well, how did you know me? And he said, because I recognized your voice from the radio. And he'd been listening to it in Sydney, Australia.
Wow.
I mean, that really got my attention.
Well, Donald, here you are, a young man living in England, and all of a sudden you take to your heart first racing itself and then this race in this obscure part of America. You end up coming to the race, and that's a phenomenal story. How did that happen?
Well, it wasn't... it was a mission. It wasn't a casual visit, as I tell people. I had decided... I'd always been fascinated by America, as portrayed in films, and thought, God, what a neat place that would be to live. So it just all kind of fit together, and I started fantasizing about going. Well, I'd never traveled anywhere except, within the British Isles, and we had relatives. My mother had relatives who lived in Chicago. And when I looked on the map, I thought, God, that's only about 200 miles.
That's right.
Could I commute every day? No, but at least there would be some, I wouldn't just be completely on my own in a foreign country. So I started saving up the money, and I really wish that I could have come in 59, 60, I was ready to do it, but there was the reality of saving the money. So it was 1964. I almost did it in 63, but it ended up being 64. And I actually wrote to a few people before coming, and one of them was Sid Collins.
Now, we should explain here for those who do not know. Sid took over the chief announcer role when the local Indianapolis stations decided that they would do the race. There was a problem where Mutual backed out. A fellow named Bill Slater had been doing the race on Mutual.
Yep.
Sid was a sportscaster in Indianapolis. He became the voice of the 500, and we'll talk at length about Sid's impact. But Sid, if you hear tapes of the race from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, that's Sid. Sid, to most of us, was the Indianapolis 500.
That's a very good way to put it, and I've used that term myself. Absolutely. He was the 500 to a lot of people.
So Sid was one of those you wrote to?
Yeah.
Did you get an answer? Obviously.
Actually, I wrote him a letter, and I suppose this must have been, the summer of 1963, and I said that I was coming and that I had this great interest and that was offering up that perhaps I could be of some use or of some assistance to the broadcast, maybe as a spotter or something. And I did not get a response, and I think a month went by, and I thought, well, let me try this again. And so I wrote him back. And this time I got this envelope arrived with a photograph in it, which he signed, and he apologized for not having responded earlier, but he did, they got huge volumes of mail. But basically he said, it's a very nice letter, but basically he said, thank you for your offer to help, but we have a staff of veteran broadcasters, and we've got statisticians and record keepers, and however, if you should make it here, come and look me up. And I'm sure he said that to everybody, and never thought this character would show up. So the next thing is that I came, and I arrived. It was when I came actually to Indianapolis. I flew to Chicago, stayed the night with relatives, got on the Greyhound bus the next day, and then came down to Indianapolis. And it was the Friday, the day before the first qualifying day. So I went to the track, and I had a lovely correspondence going with the lady who was director of ticket sales, and she said, we'll give you the bronze badge, which will get you into the garage area. And I did not ask for anything other than I was buying a ticket, and she did that out of pure kindness. So I go there, I get the bronze badge, and then the next day is the first qualifying day, and the bronze will get you in the garage area, but not the pits. So qualifying is going on, but I can't go out there. And so I'm walking through just about a deserted garage area, and around the corner, here comes Sid Collins.
Wow.
So anyway, I spoke to him, and of course he was charming with everybody, and I was taken aback because when I told him that, I couldn't get into the pit area, he kind of sort of bit his lip a little bit, and he said, well, I'll tell you what. And he reached in his pocket, and he brought out a card. They don't do this anymore, but it was like a one-day temporary pass. And he said, if you bring this back to me at the end of the day, I'll let you have this for the day, but bring it back. And he didn't know me from Adam. So anyway, I go out into the pit area, and I had met some people the day before when I got there late the afternoon Friday. So one thing led to another, and it wasn't long before they took me to the credentials office and upgraded me to a silver badge, which could get you everywhere. And so I went back up to see Sid and give him back the card at something like, 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Anyway, the thing that amazed me was I said, well, how do I find you? When he said, bring it back at the end of the day, he said, oh, just come up to the broadcast booth. And I was astonished that was so easily done. I mean, I thought there would be security and you'd have to have special passes, and I'm sorry, sir, you can't come through here. And as anyone listening that's got any, knowledge of having been at the track, for all those years at the Master Control Tower, anybody could walk up the stairs and see the broadcast booth.
That seems unbelievable.
I know.
Because, as a young man, listening to Sid or any of these broadcasts, you put these people on such a pinnacle, just from the sheer star aspect of it, you wouldn't think you could easily go up there.
No. And they would have there would be, a security guy on at the door, but they didn't have nightsticks or anything, and the general public could go up the flights of stairs and look in the broadcast booth, and there's Sid working away, and all of his the colleagues. I was just astonished at that. Anyway, I'm making a long story out of it.
No, that's fine.
Sid just sort of immediately took me under his arm or under his arm, and was like a mentor to me right off the bat. And to a lot of people, Sid was the radio broadcast, and what did he do the rest of the year? Well, as you said, he was in the sports department, and he was in sales, and he emceed a lot of functions. And that month, 1964 May, Sid emceed all kinds of dinners, lunches, breakfasts, and he was a great MC. And he was so kind to introduce me at all these functions, which must have been, maybe 7 or 8 or more. And so this thing one led to another, and I just had an incredible month of May. And he said there was some possibility that I might be on the broadcast the first year. And he took me up into the broadcast booth, and he had me meet Bill Dean, who was the producer.
Right, for years.
Do you remember Bill?
Oh, yes.
And he says, okay, Bill, watch this. And Sid had this little, it was like a little metal box that he would keep recipes in. And it was his card system that he had with driver records. So he pulled this card out and then sort of cupped it so I couldn't see it and said, all right, Bill. And he said, all right, Donald, tell me, what can you tell me about Spider Webb?
Yes.
And so I did Spider Webb's record, and then he asked me about another fellow named Johnny Fredericks, who had been at the track several times and never qualified. And so anyway, I went out of there thinking, I'm going to be on the broadcast. Well, it didn't happen, and I'm not sure why, but he did say, we'd like to have you come on as a guest. So about halfway through the race, 2/3 of the way through the race, when the thing kind of settles down a little bit, come up to the booth. And once again, there was no security or anything special on race day. I just walked out there. And he saw me and waved me in. So I was on the broadcast in '64. And then when the race was over, I reluctantly went back to England and then immediately started to prepare to come back on a permanent basis, which I did the next year. And then Sid had me as part of the, I was not in the booth, but I was part of the broadcast, and I would come in and then just do historical retrospective, and I'm basically still doing that.
Well, one summer when I was in college, Sid came to Indiana University, which is only an hour from Indianapolis, and guest taught a couple of classes, and he told us he also had what amounted to a small suitcase of newspaper clippings and things, because he said one of these times we're going to need to fill. Mm-hmm. What was the year that it took 3 days?
1973.
It paid off when that happened.
Oh, yeah, yes, uh-huh.
He was, I think we can best describe Sid Collins as a huge presence when you met him. Yes. He was always nattily attired.
Always.
Just not a clothes horse, but he looked so damned efficient.
Yes. Right.
And then you would hear him on the air, and I have, as a child listening, I realized that even though this show had a director, he was in command. Can you explain how many announcers about there were at the track, and the system Sid used to throw the microphone, if you will, to those announcers? It was absolutely poetry in radio.
Well, I think the total number of people on the air was probably, I don't know, 8 or 9, 10, because he'd have a driver expert, and that was Fred Agabasian, and he'd be in the booth with Sid, and then they had one person in each turn. That's 4, and then
one in the backstretch,
and then on the backstretch, yeah. Right? Yep.
And of course, Sid was essentially on the home stretch at the finish line.
Right. But then he would have, at least 3 in the pits, 2 or maybe 3 in the pits.
Mm-hmm. One at the track hospital.
Well, were they doing that then?
That must have been eventually.
I think that was later on.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, maybe they would dispatch a pit person to run back there, and then they decided we better have somebody permanently. That could be. But anyway, so it's probably 8 to 10 people. And he had a producer who would listen to everybody, and whenever they would call in and say, "Hey, I've got something, throw it to me," or whatever, Bill Dean had these cards that he would hold up, and it would say, Luke Walton pits or Mike Ahern turn 1 or whatever, and then Sid would throw it, and they had this switcher in the back that is actually on display in the Hall of Fame Museum right now. That switcher was built by a couple of WIBC engineers. Instead of, having some outfit build one for $50,000, the fellow just built it in the back by himself.
Now, we should explain here, not all the microphones could be on at one time.
No.
That would have been a disaster.
Yes.
And so they had to make sure when Sid called up this guy that they punched up his microphone, not too late, not too early. Yes. That itself is an art.
Yeah, I'm not sure about this, but I don't believe there was a way for anybody to override unless the switch was open. So I don't remember that exactly, but so it was quite a production. Anyway, what Sid would do was a couple of things. He did not have a great deep knowledge of auto racing, and said so. He liked the people, but he said, "I'm not an expert." He said, "So I like to surround myself with people who are," and he said, "I like to think of myself as an orchestra conductor."
Yes.
I'm just sort of pointing to where I'm the director as to where, who's going to tell us what. And he said, and he really liked quotes and color. He liked word picture. He says, "We're going to paint word pictures here because the people listening, some of them, a lot of people are blind, but regardless, they're listening on the radio, so they can't see this. We have to describe it in such a way that they will be able to see it." So he said, "So give me color."
Yeah, no car was simply red or orange or white. It was some kind of white.
That's right. He said, "If the car is red and the helmet's yellow, tell me that. And if you know specifically that it's candy apple red, tell me that." I remember that specifically.
Yes. And also, I think the idea of having a race driver as a sidekick was such a good deal. And Freddie Agabasian, I call him Freddie, was the funniest guy.
Yeah. Yeah, he was very... Actually, he had this very gravelly voice. I won't even try to do it, except it was sort of, "Yes, Dad." Anyway, it was a gravelly voice, and but he was very articulate. Former driver, had been on the pole, was on the front row 3 times, but he was an engineer type, and he used terms like malfunction, when other drivers, when most people wouldn't. And I remember even my dad would listen, and he was very impressed with Fred Agabasian's not only his delivery but his choice of words.
Well, it kind of reminds me of Bobby Rahal.
Yes.
In a way, someone who was both a driver but knew a tremendous amount about the car. You mentioned Luke Walton.
Yes.
Luke was another Indianapolis television personality who sounded as if he had been an auctioneer early on. He would, I can't begin to imitate him, but he'd go down the pit, talk about the tire coming off, and they're off, you know. And it would take your breath away listening to Luke Walton's description of a tire change.
He was never an auctioneer, but he was an old-time radio guy. He was a band leader.
You're kidding.
No, he had an outfit, and I remember he told me one time that he was leading this group, and there was something to do with timing on Charles Lindbergh was supposed to come out of an elevator at a certain time, and there was some miscues, and I think they were going to play Lucky Lindy. There's a book called The Jazz State of Indiana, which is a whole other subject. But anyway, Luke appears in that book several times.
Wow. I remember, as an aside here, in early television, of course, everything was live.
Yeah.
And I remember Luke Walton was doing a television commercial for a car dealership. It might have been Foxworthy Ford in Indianapolis. I can't remember. But they had the back of the studio with two big doors, and they were driving these cars past him. Well, at one point, he looks over and realizes that one of the cars has stalled. So now he's in an empty studio with no cars going past, and he's got a sheet, and he says, and if you could see it over there, there's a 1956 Ford, and behind that out in the street is, and behind it is, and he just went on, you know, and salvaged the entire commercial. Mm-hmm. It was a wonderful moment. When you first went to the track, and I must confess, I never saw the track physically till I was in my 30s. Mm-hmm. What was your thought when you first walked in and saw what they now call the old brickyard?
Well, it was. That's a good question, because I couldn't believe I was there. It was sort of the culmination of a good part of my life at that point, but it was also a beginning. I don't know if I realized that at the time, but I mean, it just my life changed. Probably the things that surprised me the most was, number one, I couldn't believe how easy the track was to get to. And that was, you know, because as I said earlier, I came down on a Greyhound bus, arrived downtown, didn't know where I was. People told me, very friendly. Everybody was so helpful. They told me what bus to get on to go to the track. And I was concerned that I would miss the stop that you get off. Because if you go to Wembley Stadium in London, you go on the train to Wembley Station, and when you get off, you're not, you know, you got to walk a distance to get to the stadium. And I thought, you know, I'll miss the stop and you know, have to get on another bus to go back. And so actually, other people on the bus were talking to me, and I wanted to make absolutely sure that I didn't miss the thing. So I come out 16th Street, and you go underneath the underpass for the railway, and when you come out the other side of the underpass, my golly, the grandstands were right next to the road. And the bus goes down to the corner of 16th and Georgetown to where the main entrance used to be with the offices, and I couldn't believe that there it is. So you get off the bus, and I walked 20 steps or whatever it was, and I'm in the front door. That was the one surprise, was the fact that it was so close to the roads.
Right. When you drive, well, for example, if you went north on Georgetown,
oh yeah,
you're looking under the bleachers almost.
Practically, yes. I mean, they're so tall and imposing. Yeah, they're practically hanging out over you. They're not, but that's the illusion. But anyway, I mean, I thought that you would get off and that the track would be in the middle of like a large park, and that you would have to trudge for quite some distance to get there. So that was surprise number one. And then the other one, and this is going to sound like, you know, PR talking, but it's true. I was amazed at how friendly and accessible the drivers were, and the crew, all of the mechanics, and the car owners. And the thing was that I was used to an England that's rather different to the England now, but there was very much class distinction. and I would call everybody sir, and I was amazed that you would have millionaires rubbing shoulders with very much non-millionaires, and you couldn't pick one out, and that they would be dressed very casually, and I would call them Mr. So-and-so, and they would call me by my first name.
On the phone from his office at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, Indy historian Donald Davidson. And Donald, even though the track has been absorbed now by the city of Indianapolis, that whole area is one urban area. When it was built in the early part of the last century, it was out in the middle of nowhere.
It was all farmland, and then when the track went in, then there was community out there, but it was pretty much farmhouses, and then the community, both industry and housing, developed around the track quite quickly. In fact, I live in Speedway right now, and on race day, I walk to the track, and typically can be in the museum in probably between 15 and 20 minutes walking.
Wow. Let me ask a few things that, not to tax your brain here, but I've always wondered about. I read somewhere that the 2.5 miles of the track is measured from a specific point. It's not the middle of the track.
No, 3 feet from the inside all the way around, and maybe that doesn't make any sense, but in 1909 it did, because you would hug the fence for the entire lap.
Yeah, when you were only doing about 75 miles an hour, which I think when Ray Haroon won the first race, that was about the average, was it not?
That is correct, yes.
That you didn't go up on the banking.
No, nobody did that.
But they had the foresight, even back then, to bank that track.
Oh, yeah. Well, the reason that they did that was that if you overcooked a turn, that you would be able to go up it and diamond back down and save the thing.
Also helps drainage when it rains.
Oh, yes, sure. It would dry out in a hurry, yes.
Donald Davidson, you have not only put in your mind a great deal of the history of racing before you ever got to the track, but I would think for a kid from England who comes to the United States and fulfills a dream of being associated with the 500, meeting not just Sid and the staff, but meeting the ebb and flow of all the drivers who come in, many of them international drivers, must really be something you can't describe how great that is. I mean, I would be like a little kid in a candy shop every time a new driver came in.
Well, a lot of people have their pinch me moment. I couldn't pick one out because I've had so many. I mean, just the drivers that I met, all the way from Ray Haroon and Peter DiPaolo, and I could go on and on with drivers. But not only that, but the number of people that I have met by having an involvement with the track that I couldn't imagine that I would ever meet. And I'm talking Ed Sullivan, James Stewart, Jesse Owens. I met Edward G. Robinson in London and Mel Torme, but golly, James Garner.
Well, that was something Sid did that was really an innovation. He would begin to invite the visiting dignitaries and stars up to the press box, yep, which was in what they called the old pagoda at one time, which I think burned, didn't it?
Well, the pagoda, actually, there were two. The first one they actually burned down deliberately.
Oh, okay.
For a new one. The first one went up in 1913, and it was right next to the edge of the track, and then they decided to build another one, so they burned the first one down. The second one went from 26 to 56, but yes, when Sid started broadcasting, it was this old Japanese-style pagoda. But his thinking on the race, in those, for the first few years of the broadcast, you didn't have driving in and out of the pits all the time and packing up behind the pace car. The race was very much of an enduro, and in fact, when they first started to do it, the leader would get by on one pit stop. And so the thing was pretty much of a grind. And Sid thought, there's a lot of times when it's just cars going by and there's nothing much we can really talk about. So he began to invite the guests to come into the booth. And as the nature of the race began to change, that became tougher and tougher to do because there was more activity on the track. But he would have politicians, and he'd have Lon Green and Dan Blocker and Michael Landon and James Stewart, as I mentioned. And
I remember Dinah Shore talking about, instead of the pace car, she called it the pacing car, which let you know that she knew a little bit about the race, but not a lot.
Well, what I remember about that is that it was 1955 was the year, and she was there because of Chevrolet, but she sang Back Home Again in Indiana, and she, to this date, is the only female that did it solo. But anyway, Sid asked her if she had a favorite, and she said yes, Jack McGrath. And I fell off my chair when I heard that, because she said, I live in Pasadena, and I know that he's from there.
Wow. The singing of Back Home Again in Indiana, and it reminds me of my old Kentucky home at the Kentucky Derby.
Absolutely.
I worked with a woman from Louisville, and we were in Washington, D.C., and she told me, we were watching the 500, I said, I just sob every time I hear Back Home Again in Indiana. She said, how do you think I feel when I watch the Kentucky Derby?
Absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, I was down there once, 1980, and I was on the infield, and when they sang My Old Kentucky Home, I looked around, and here's all these people with their flowery hats on, and everybody was getting their handkerchiefs out. And I thought, you know what? This is not doing it for me, but I understand. I mean, there are a number of parallels, and you absolutely nailed that one.
Well, and they're only 2 hours apart by car. That's the other thing. If I may, let me paint a word picture here, because I think I represent millions of people in this way. I grew up in the 50s and 60s in southern Indiana. This was back when every radio station in Indiana carried the race. You could tune across the dial and not hear anything but the Indianapolis 500.
Yep.
My dad would pick Memorial Day as a time to put up the screen windows for summer and the front porch and wash the car. My mom would be inside cooking. We'd have every window down, every radio on, including the one in the car. Yep. The big paper in Indianapolis, the Indianapolis Star, used to print, maybe still does, a grid on page 1,
right,
where you can follow the track. Sid would give a wrap-up, every 50 miles, every 100 miles, I guess.
It was every 10 laps he tried to do.
Right. And it was a ritual. I mean, when I think of the track, when I hear Sid Collins' voice in my mind, I'm a little kid again in Washington, Indiana, helping my dad wash the car. And I think there must be millions of people who have a similar memory, all because of that race.
Absolutely. I hear that all the time. I've heard it for decades. Yeah, that was just, everybody did that.
Well, now, Donald Davidson, tell us then about how your career changed. Certainly you went from being a rabid fan with an encyclopedic memory of the race to someone who's now and has been working at the race. And then don't let me forget to ask you about your 40-year-plus radio show.
Oh, okay. Well, you're very kind. I was at the track in 64. I came back in 65 on a one-way ticket and a green card, and I was Sid put me on the radio network, and then I was befriended by a man named Henry Banks, who was a former driver, a national champion, 500 driver, and he was the director of competition for the United States Auto Club, USAC, and he hired me. So as soon as the 65 500 was over, within a week, I was working at USAC. So those are the two people to whom I owe the greatest deal, the greatest gratitude is Sid Collins and Henry Banks. So anyway, the following spring, Sid, who I was in contact with now living in Indianapolis, so, I would meet with him and we'd have lunch and dinner and so forth, and he had this idea for a radio program in which people would call in and try to stump me or, ask questions. And so we did that in 1966. It was called DONALD DAVIDSON. It ran 15 minutes, and the host was a fellow named Charlie Brown. That wasn't his real name. And anyway, we were going to do it the next year, and there was a reality check. As an immigrant, I had to join. I had to register with the local draft board, and it ended up that I joined the National Guard, and I was going to be in basic training and barely get back in time for the 67 race. So we didn't do the program. But I did get back, and I was on the race day broadcast, and then things sort of kind of changed at the radio station. And then in 1971, with new management, and they decided, let's cover the race like it's never been done before. And one of the things was, let's do this radio program where they call in and ask Donald questions. So we started that, and I think it was every weeknight in May, and it's been pretty much since. At the time, I mean, we were talking, before the interview started here about how radio was different then. At the time they did that, 1971, talk on radio was taboo. And the word that I remember was, you just play music, and when the one ends, you go to the next one as quick as possible. If you talk 45 seconds or a minute, you're going to lose them. They're going to go to another radio station. And so kind of as an experiment, we did this call-in show, which I think was 30 minutes, and it wasn't long before we were to 45 and then an hour. And basically, we're still doing that one.
And that's how many years now?
This was the 40th year, but actually the 41st season.
Wow. A couple of other things I want to quickly get into. I heard a story once about why they picked 500 miles for the race. What is your take on that? Because mine's kind of funny.
Okay, well, the take is that they had run races in 1909 and 1910, and typically they would run a 3-day meet. 3 days of racing with 8 to 10 races in a day, short races and then a long one at the end of the day. The attendance during the summer began to drop off. They had a Memorial Day weekend, which was successful, but the 4th of July weekend and Labor Day weekend, they weren't getting the crowds. And so they thought, well, we built this as a testing facility, but also to run races so that the public could come out and decide what would be a good car for them to buy, because it was supposed to be stripped-down passenger cars. And so after the Labor Day meet, they thought, well, we're doing something wrong here. What do we need to do to get the people? Should we just forget racing altogether? And so apparently the thinking was, no, let's do one race. We'll make it a long race, and we'll make it last about the length of time that a typical program would last. Apparently, Carl Fisher, who had the concept of the track was his, may have said, let's have a 1,000-mile race, and it could be his partner, James Allison, later of Allison Engineering, who said, wait a minute, that's too long. So the thinking was, let's start something at 10 o'clock and have it over by 5, and 6 in the early evening. What could we have in that time? 500 miles fit the bill, and so that's what they decided to have.
I also heard that it also meant that people had to buy 2 meals while they were there.
I never heard that one before. Carl Fisher did say we need to get them. The thinking was we need to get them home in time for supper.
Oh, okay, all right. That my story I heard doesn't hold water. Then you talk about Carl Fisher. A lot of people don't realize that not only was he an innovator and an engineer, but he was largely responsible for the early evolution of better highways in the U.S.
Yes, absolutely. I'm often asked, is he the Fisher of Fisher Body? And the answer is no. But he is the man who developed Miami Beach from swamplands into the resort area, and then he headed up, and this is all like at the same time, the track was being built. Very shortly thereafter, he headed up the Lincoln Highway Commission, to build the first transcontinental highway.
Which unfortunately does not go through Indianapolis.
No, it doesn't. It goes through South Bend and then sort of like south of Chicago, I think. But anyway, that was his. And then the Dixie Highway, which goes all the way down to Miami, and you can still drive that. I mean, you can actually drive Highway 1 all the way down to Miami, and that was Fisher.
You know, one of the things I always thought as I looked at your career, Sid Collins was never married. I always thought of you in a way of being the son he never had.
Wow. Nobody's ever suggested that before, but that's very kind of you.
Well, he was such a mentor to you,
Mm-hmm.
and the chemistry must have been really almost instant between the two of you.
Well, it seems to have been, and that's very kind of you to say that. I mean, honestly, nobody's ever said that before. But and I'd have to think about the difference in age. But no, that would be. He could have been. Yeah, I suppose he could have been my father. I never thought of that, but definitely he very much was a mentor and a guardian almost.
David, has anyone else ever tried to call you David Donaldson?
Oh, yes, that happens all the time. Yes.
Donald Davidson, let me wrap up with a few questions here. There's one driver who ended up losing his life in Indianapolis, and there's a legendary story about how Sid, having to announce the death, improvised a eulogy, which today will drive you to get a box of Kleenex. What was Eddie Sachs like?
Oh, Eddie Sachs! I did meet him, because that was the year that he was fatally injured. So I met him, and I got a photograph to prove it. And he was a very interesting guy, very emotional, very funny, but also emotional, and very popular with the crowd because he was so over the top on the microphone whenever he had any success. So his loss, I mean, was a great one for the sport because he was so well known, so popular. And I have to say about the Sid eulogy that while that was pretty much off the top of his head, Sid was all about preparedness. And because racing was so dangerous at that time, I mean, Sid was constantly thinking. He read a lot. And so when you hear those famous quotes at the end of the broadcast, I mean, that might be something that Sid had seen months before and thought, by golly, that's a good one. Let's keep that. So he did way more preparation, than he would need to do. But I have to think that because racing was so dangerous, he must have thought, if he was working in the yard or driving somewhere, if something terrible was to happen, what would I say?
Those moments of listening to the 500 are just magic to me.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. I agree with everything that you say, and I experienced it myself, and I've heard it from so many others, and it was just a thrill and an honor to be part of it. And I mean, this is sounding corny now, but I did leave a dream. I mean, there's times when I had issues like everybody does, but for all of these years and to still be doing it, I'm just sort of so blessed.
Donald Davidson, I have to get back home to Indiana sometime, and we need to do lunch, but like most people in radio, you have 1,000 stories, but unlike most of them, you have 1,000 stories because you have the races in your head.
Well, I do like to tell the radio stories because there's a lot of fun things that happen behind the scenes.
Well, Donald, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for going back into the archives with me. I'm Dennis Daly. See you next time, right here on YouTube.